Hi, I'm James Michael Reilly, and welcome to Worse, episode 107. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Up tonight, we are looking at Heart of Glass, the mountain man who wouldn't quit. We're looking at N.Why, and the first layer of fatigue. So if you want to grab something to eat and drink, please do. Tonight I'm drinking Corbett Canyon Cabernet, a very, shall we say, affordable red wine. And I'm having a mixed plate of olives and pickles. All right, so if you want to pause this, grab something to eat, come back and join us. Let's get started. All right, Heart of Glass. The story is not unknown, but some of the details might be new and of interest to you. Of the mountain man Hugh Glass, born in 1783, died in 1833. So born before or shortly after the United States became a country, a fur trapper who went west and had many, many adventures there. He was made famous most recently by the 2015 movie The Revenant, which is a fictionalized account of an encounter he had with a grizzly bear. It starred Leonardo DiCaprio. And that was itself based on a 2002 novel by a guy named Michael Punke, who, interestingly, was also the U.S. trade representative and the U.S. ambassador to the World Trade Organization from 2010 to 2017. That's quite a resume that guy's got there. At any rate, Hugh Glass made his career in the West, in the wilderness, on the frontier. And in 1823, in a fur trading expedition, he was wounded in a fight with some Native Americans, but survived that, continued on the expedition. And then in August of 1823, near present-day Lemon, South Dakota, that's Lemmon, South Dakota, he was attacked by a grizzly bear. The bear ripped his throat, broke his leg, and gave him numerous puncture wounds. His companions put him on a litter and carried him for 2 days, but given their history of conflict with Native Americans, they realized that the slow pace that was imposed upon them by carrying Hugh Glass was putting the entire expedition at risk. So the commander made a decision, since they were certain that Glass was going to die anyway, to have two of the men, in exchange for a monetary reward, stay behind and stay with Glass until he died. And those two men were named Jim Bridger, and I believe it's John Fitzgerald. I'm not 100% sure of Fitzgerald's first name, but Bridger and Fitzgerald. So they stayed with Glass for 5 days, and then they began to feel the fear and the burden of the fact that Native Americans hostile to them, for probably very good reason, were in the area and that they were at risk. At one point they determined, or rather Fitzgerald prevailed upon Bridger, this is the belief, that Glass would not survive till morning. And so they put him by a flowing spring, isn't that nice of them, and left. And since he was a dead man, as far as they were concerned, they took his gun, his knife, and the kit he had for starting a fire. So there he is with his body ripped apart by a bear, no weapons, no way to start a fire. And Hugh Glass didn't die. One account that I heard in a book I highly recommend, Charles Kuralt's America, came out in the mid-90s. And in Kuralt's discussion in one of the chapters of the book, he says that Glass happened to be under a berry bush where he was laying, and he ate the berries and somehow regained enough of his strength to begin crawling back to help and safety, which was a fort 200 to 300 miles away. He eventually recovered to the point where he was able to walk. He came across at one point wolves that had recently killed a buffalo, and he waited till they ate their fill, and then he was able to make off with a large part of the carcass of the buffalo, and then just kind of like camped for several days and ate it to regain his strength further. I'm not clear on whether he was eating it raw or not. The movie The Revenant indicates that that was what was happening. But at any rate, this was one of the things that he found to give himself strength. And then he eventually made his way back to Fort Kiowa. And it was about 2.5 months after his attack, around mid-October, that he showed up at Fort Kiowa. Now, I want to back up for a minute to talk about exactly what happened in this attack. I recommend the movie, but it is not for the faint of heart. It's not the kind of thing where I would say you'll have a great time. Please see it. Just to draw an analogy for you, this bear attack, and you can find it on YouTube, it's about a 6-minute chunk of the movie, is, in my opinion, quite an achievement of movie effects. You may have seen the very controversial movie The Passion of the Christ, made by Mel Gibson. One of the things that I am grateful to that movie for is that I came away with a fuller understanding of something that as a Christian I'd heard my whole life, that Jesus was scourged at the pillar. You see The Passion of the Christ and you come away from the movie saying, oh, so that's what scourging is. Well, you come away from The Revenant saying, oh, that's what a grizzly bear can do to a person. Aspects of it that had never occurred to you, like the bear standing on you, a several 100-pound bear standing on you, monitoring your face to see if you're moving so it knows whether to keep ripping you apart or not. At any rate, there are some interesting stories in the New York Times about the making of this movie and an interview with the director. But there was an account of the making of the costumes for the movie. Hugh Glass ends up with the bear's pelt. And so they wanted an actual grizzly bear pelt for the film, but grizzly bears are a protected species. They're considered a threatened species. So you can't just go sending grizzly bear skins through the mail. So they located a grizzly bear pelt in Canada, and they had to jump through all sorts of hoops with customs and whatnot, and probably the EPA, to get the thing into the United States to use it for the movie, some of which was not shot in the U.S., I hasten to add. They had to go where snow was because so much of it happens in cold weather. But at any rate, the Hugh Glass's character had 3 levels of costume: before the bear attack, during the bear attack, and after the bear attack. That was the challenge that the costume designer for that movie was faced with. At any rate, getting back to the real Hugh Glass, when he finally got back to Fort Kiowa, he spent just a very brief time recovering, and then he went out to find Bridger and Fitzgerald, the 2 men who had abandoned him, to kill them. He finally tracked down Bridger at another fort where he accompanied a party of men to get there, many of whom were killed by Native Americans on the way, I'll hasten to add. And when he got there, Fitzgerald was not there, but Bridger was. In a conversation with him, he realized that Bridger, being the younger man, I think he was 20 at most, possibly younger than that, had been prevailed upon by Fitzgerald, the older, wiser, perhaps more manipulative of the two, to abandon Glass. And so Glass forgave him. But Fitzgerald still had his gun. So he went on another lengthy journey to another fort to find Fitzgerald. When he got there, Fitzgerald was there, but Fitzgerald had joined the army at that point. Now the army had opinions of its own about whether somebody could come in, however justified, and just kill one of the soldiers in a revenge killing. So they said to Glass, no, you're not going to do that. They did get him his gun back from Fitzgerald, and they compensated him like $200 or $300 for his trouble. The point I'd like to make about Hugh Glass in this is that despite his, what most of us would say, well-justified desire for revenge, which he didn't ultimately get, he didn't stop it. He didn't let it stop him. He continued to have adventures, and much like the Rodney Fox, the diver who went back in the ocean after being attacked by a great white shark, someone we discussed in One Worse a couple of weeks ago, he went back to the wilderness and in long expeditions into the Southwest, into the Rockies. So he went back to trapping, and in 1833, 10 years after he had been attacked, he was near Fort Cass in Montana, And in another confrontation with Native Americans, Hugh Glass is finally killed. His record, like that of so many Americans at this time, is extremely tainted by his treatment of Native Americans and the way that the United States and the commercial enterprises at the time, like fur trading companies, were treating Native Americans. But what I wish to draw attention to is his resilience and the fact that he set out to do one thing and didn't succeed in that, but he went on. He persisted. And he pushed forward in something that others would have said very justifiably, you have every right to be afraid of going back into the wilderness. And I wouldn't blame you for never doing it again. I have a lot of respect for that. Okay, let's wind ourselves a little closer to the present now and look at N.Why. I was doing a play off Broadway in New York City in 2019. And my stepdaughter and her boyfriend came to visit, saw the show. His name is Danny, and he had been in New York City before, I believe, but has spent most of his time in the wide open spaces of the West. He's someone who enjoys hiking and camping and rock climbing. After the show, we were walking through Times Square with all its, where the lights are so bright, by the way, that it's really difficult to distinguish day from night if you don't look at the sky. It's kind of an amazing thing to say if you haven't been there, but it's true. We were walking through Times Square with all this cacophony of sound and bright flashing lights, people milling about, some of them in costume. And Danny said, "Why would anybody want to live here?" Now, apart from it being a very reasonable question, it was one that was very thought-provoking for me, because one of the songs that I have worked on in developing myself as a musical theater actor is a song from the show Annie, the famous musical, one of the most successful musicals of all time. And it's a song called N.Why. So Annie was written by Charles Strauss, Martin Charnin, and Ed Meehan. Let me give you a sample of the lyrics that start the song, where the character Daddy Warbucks, the rich military contractor, by the way, who takes Annie under his wing and provides a home for little orphan Annie, sings, "NYC, what is it about you? You're big, you're loud, you're tough. NYC, I go years without you, then I can't get enough. Enough of cab drivers answering back in language far from pure. Enough of Frankfurters answering back. Hey, brother, you know you're in NYC." So the question posed by Danny as we were walking across Times Square was illuminating for me. Why would anybody like this? I have been treating it as a rhetorical question, but it's a real question. And part of the answer to that, and let me put it this way, there is not really so much an answer as a response. It lies in two nested experiences of New York City that have to do with the show Annie. Annie was based on the 1924 comic strip called Little Orphan Annie, created by Harold Gray. So though it started in the boom years of the Roaring '20s, the musical of Annie chooses to set it in the Depression era. And that's not moving the music, that's not moving the story somewhere it wasn't. Annie was written as a comic strip for a very, very long time by Harold Gray, its original creator, from 1924 through the 1960s until his death. And then it was picked up and resuscitated at various times subsequent to that. But at any rate, the play focuses on the time of Annie's adventures during the Depression. And that was a time when it really wasn't much fun to be in New York City. It's underscored by the fact that Daddy Warbucks, Annie's rich benefactor, in the comic strip loses everything and has to move to a small apartment with Annie, going out, struggling to find a job, struggling to find money to put food on the table and pay the rent. This was a time when a third of New York City's population was out of work. Things were terrible all over the country. And we looked in a previous episode of Worse at the experiences of the Dust Bowl during the Depression in Oklahoma. But because New York City was the financial center, and because the Great Depression was precipitated by the crash of 1929, it was first and foremost a financial collapse. So New York City, being the financial center of the country, experienced it particularly hard. The concept of Hoovervilles came up at this time. Herbert Hoover was someone who said he would lift people out of the Depression and didn't do a very good job of it. So the shanty towns that were set up, some of them in Central Park in New York City, where several hundred people lived during the Depression, these little shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. So New York City was a pretty nasty place during that time. You can see why Daddy Warbucks would have cause to ask himself, what is it about you? What is it about New York City that I like? It makes no sense. But there's another reason nested within that one, and that has to do with the creation of the musical. Annie the Musical was begun in 1976. It premiered at a theater called Goodspeed Opera House, now called Goodspeed Musicals, in Connecticut. In 1977, moved to Broadway, won a bunch of awards, and ran for 6 or 7 years, one of the most successful musicals of all time. New York City, at the time of the creation of the musical Annie, was a dump. And take it from someone whose father worked in New York City at that time and who lived just a commuting distance away in New Jersey. New York City in 1977 was a scary place. To give you some perspective, 2 years before that, in 1975, if you got off a plane at LaGuardia Airport or John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, you might encounter an off-duty policeman handing you a pamphlet with a skull in a shroud that said, "Welcome to Fear City." Now, this was a technique undertaken by members of the police union to highlight budget cuts and cuts to the police force that were being considered by the mayor at that time. And a judge upheld their right as private citizens in their off-duty hours to do things like this. But the fact is, policemen were handing people arriving in the city things that said, "Welcome to Fear City," with advice like, never leave your hotel room after 6 a.m., always guard your handbag, don't leave Manhattan. This was New York City. In 76 and into 77, that was the time when the son of Sam, one of the most famous serial killers in American history, was going around finding couples necking in cars and shooting them dead. 1977, the year Annie came out, was the same year as one of New York City's most famous or infamous blackouts, when in the mayhem that resulted from the electricity failing and all the power going out, that huge parts of the city burned to the ground in riots and looting, and stayed that way for decades. In 1981, a few years after that, to give you an idea of how bad things got, that was when a movie came out starring Paul Newman called Fort Apache, the Bronx. Fort Apache was the name of a police precinct in the South Bronx, where the South Bronx had gotten so bad that they used the now we would consider somewhat racist term to describe it as like a fort on the frontier, circling back to Hugh Glass. That's what New York City was like in the 1970s when this play came out. NYC, what is it about you? There is no reason any sane person would like this. A few years ago, National Geographic came out with a ranking of the most important cities in the world. New York City ranked number 1. Business Insider, an online source that I am not certain of the reliability of, but I'd be interested to hear if you know anything about this. Please add it to the comments section on YouTube. Reports that a management consultancy firm created a ranking of world cities based on business activity, culture, human capital, political engagement, information exchange. New York City, number 1. Charles Kuralt, the gentleman I spoke about who wrote America, said in his last chapter of the book, because Kuralt, a diehard patriot and lover of all parts of this country, lived in New York City. And he said, New York City is where you go to test yourself against the best. If you work in advertising, in finance, in acting, in entrepreneurship, and so many other things. New York City re-provokes the question, why would anybody want to be here all the time? I can give you a little idea. I can speak to my own experience. It forces me to move my energy to a higher level. It's stimulating in every sense. It is overstimulating, as I have heard it put. The pizza is fantastic. The neighborhoods are so different. You're forced to be in close to proximity with people very, very different from yourself. You see things that never occurred to you before. This year, during coronavirus, the murder rate in New York City has surged. The city had, I don't know the exact number, and I apologize for that, but about 450 murders in 2020. That's versus 319 murders the year before. That's a giant increase. But I have a friend who is a recently widowed woman who lived in New York City with her husband and her 2 young girls. And her husband became very, very ill. And when it was clear he was entering the final stages of cancer, they moved out of the city. This was in the spring of 2020, and spent time with relatives in various places, including Germany, after her husband passed away. Late last year, she came and stayed with us for a few days, and then one morning, I drove her back to their apartment on the upper west side of Manhattan, an area known as the Little Dominican Republic. An ethnic group, by the way, which she bears no resemblance to in any way, ethnically or in terms of what she looks like. And there she has lived with her little girls since then, these last 2 months, during this time of this surge in crime in New York City. Because let me put it in perspective for you. The crime rate, the murder rate this year was about 450 people, and that's a surge from the previous year. 10 years ago, it was 536 murders in the year. 20 years ago, it was 673. And in 1990, the year that I began lining up for auditions as a New York actor, there were 2,245 people murdered in New York City. So my friend, with her 2 little girls, plays with them confidently in the park across their street, having a fuller understanding of that statistic than you might have if you didn't look at the long view. NYC, what is it about you? Everyone holds a different light on that question, and maybe you can come and shine yours. My thanks to nyc.gov for their crime statistics, to the New York Times, to Annika Chapin and Michael Fling at Goodspeed Musicals, at virginia.edu, and others. Okay. First layer of fatigue. Here's a quote from 1907. Everyone is familiar with the phenomenon of feeling more or less alive on different days. Most of us feel as if we lived habitually with a sort of cloud laying on us, below our highest notch of clearness and discernment, sureness in reasoning, or firmness in deciding. We're making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. That's a quote from William James in his book, The Energies of Men. William James is an American psychologist and philosopher who lived from 1842 to 1910. And what he was looking at in that passage was what he coined the first layer of fatigue. That place where you reach a point of feeling exhausted, feeling you can't do anymore in a given endeavor, and that if you push past it, if you push through those feelings of tiredness and those feelings that you don't have anything more, you discover beyond it resources of energy and activity and achievement that you didn't know you were capable of. So, and that is what we call, and what was called from long before the time of William James, the second wind. Ordinarily, we stop when we meet that first layer of fatigue. But if we get past it, we're fresher than before. We have evidently tapped a level of new energy, James said, masked until then by the fatigue obstacle, usually obeyed. So the Harvard Business Review is looking at it this year, given these unusual circumstances, where people hit their first layer of fatigue starting late last year. They rallied. There was a feeling of enthusiasm, a feeling of banding together against the common enemy of the pandemic when it first hit. But now we're in the long stretch, and people are getting pandemic fatigue, the endless wait People who found enthusiasm to exercise early middle last year, and now find that enthusiasm subsiding and their equipment gathering dust. So the Harvard Business Review posed the question: how do you find the mental strength to lead? Because this is a publication for leaders, to lead through the last mile. So there are a number of questions, a number of answers to that. The first wave, this will shed some light, is motivated by adrenaline, a fighting spirit, pulling together. It's a psychological response of arousal, but that arousal can't last forever. So when the first layer of fatigue hits, how do you get past it to the second wind? Well, the Harvard Business Review suggested a twofold approach. One is, first of all, to acknowledge the tiredness, the feelings of vulnerability that people are having. And in leaders, it could be useful to acknowledge those feelings in themselves. But if you just stop there, you can lead people into a feeling of learned helplessness. Okay, here we are, we have a right to be tired, the end. But there's a second thing that's necessary, which is that to bring on feelings of defiance, anger, fear, frustration even. Interesting that they would say that the employment of those apparently negative emotions can be a useful thing in this situation. To recognize that taking action, even when that action turns out to be wrong, can be better than taking no action at all. So when you feel the doubts that accompany the first layer of fatigue, what's the point? We've been trying and trying and trying, and here we still are in this problem. Take action, even if you're not 100% sure it's right. The author of this Harvard Business Review article wrote a book called Battle Mind, and she quoted a high-ranking NATO officer saying, the consequences are often greater if you decide not to act than if you do act. Sort of counterintuitive there, but inspiring at the same time. There are a number of things that can provoke the second wind and motivate it, not just the negative things we mentioned before, like defiance and anger, but love. A promotion can cause a feeling of a second wind, an inspiring opportunity, discovery of new hope. And one of the interesting things that William James said is that there may be layer after layer of this experience. There may be a third wind. There may be a fourth wind. And that's actually good news for those of us who hope to thrive as the vaccine rolls out and, God willing, we move past this, in that the end of the pandemic may kick off a feeding frenzy in business that will make it necessary to work hard to seize opportunities when everyone else is suddenly seizing them too. So William James said, war and shipwrecks show what men and women are capable of. Something I want to look at in a future episode, specifically with regard to war, is the experience of the U.S. Marines on the island of Guadalcanal during World War II. That was from August 42 to February of 43, a long battle to stop the Japanese advance in the Solomon Islands. So rather than get into that too much, having looked at these clues, I'll simply say that, as James said, in exceptional cases, we may find, beyond the very extremity of fatigue distress, amounts of ease and power that we never dreamed ourselves to own. So I want to thank Stanford University website, the York University of Toronto website, and the Harvard Business Review, as well as the Marine Corps History website, and history.com and historynet.com for some of the information provided in this. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate you spending the time with me, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And hang in there, folks. We'll get through this. We've been through worse.